Hey there, Professor Snart checking in. Let's see what's going on. Well, I've moved offices. Give you the tour. Boxes now in this office. Gym towel covering my big glass door or window in the door, which is creepy. There's my degree and my teaching award right in that area there. Okay, moving on. Books, crappy stuff on the tack board or whatever. Fancy phone with way more buttons than I know how to use. Yeah, pretty exciting stuff. Speaking of exciting, okay, we are halfway through our course now, which is hard to believe, past midterm already. We have just finished up a unit 7, completing a poem, and now we prep for our next workshop. So everything's set up, the groups are all ready to go. I've checked in both groups. There's been at least one person excuse me, who's posted and attached the files, so I know all that stuff's working correctly. So hopefully everything is working correctly for everybody. If you don't see your name in a group, contact me right away and I'll make sure you get in there. Because I try to rearrange people in groups for our various workshops, sometimes I just remove one person but forget to add them to the others. So it happens, so just let me know if you don't see your name there. But we get into our next workshop, which means 2 separate due dates: the posting due date, which is this Friday, June 15th, and then some turnaround time so you can provide feedback. Notice that there's 2 fairly substantial groups here, so there's lots of people to provide feedback to, which is more work for you as the reviewer, but also is beneficial for you as the writer because you're getting that much more feedback. And again, like I said before, and like you've now experienced as a writer from our first workshop, you kind of know what sort of feedback is really the most helpful, honestly, for improving your writing. So the kind of feedback you want to be getting from people, or that sort of investment of their energy, be sure you're giving that back as a reviewer of their work when you give them feedback. So again, the golden rule sort of applies. But I just wanted to say a quick word about the completing a poem assignment, which is like so much of what we do outside of the workshops. It's just an exercise. So it's not like you would add a couple of lines to an existing poem and call it your own and submit it for publication, right? So we would never use that as a piece of our own writing. But it's maybe, if not the most, certainly one of the most important poetic exercises I think I've ever developed or run across. And it's useful for students, but for anybody as a writer in any genre, not just poetry. But I think it's specifically well suited to poetry for a couple of reasons. And it's worth mentioning here because that sort of idea of like copying the style of somebody, even so much down to the level of like actually adding lines to their poem, either at the beginning or the end or in the middle somewhere, it often runs counter to what a lot of writers feel, especially as they first start out, that they don't want to read a lot of other people's work. They don't want to sound like they're imitating. In fact, we place such a premium on being original. A lot of novice writers really fear sounding like somebody else. Listen to any experienced published writer, though, and they will tell you point blank that they are at their best when they sound like somebody else. And in fact, a quote-unquote authentic voice of their own really probably only emerges from a long apprenticeship of sounding or trying to sound like somebody else. So it's not endorsing plagiarism, obviously, but we need to kind of abandon notions that to be a good poet, you don't want to read too much other poetry, or you don't want to sound like what other people sound like. That's really not the case. You want to be discerning in terms of how you sound and who you sound like and who you read. But it's not like you have to sort of isolate yourself and that's how you develop a voice of your own. So the completing a poem assignment is really, really great because what it does, if you do it correctly, is that it really forces you to tune your ear to what's going on, to what makes a poetic voice sound the way it does. Is it diction? Is it sort of like choices of line length? What elements of style are there that seem kind of particular to this poetic voice that are different in other poetic voices? And so to enter into that, you really enter in not first as a writer, right, but as a reader, a really, really attentive reader. So the completing a poem assignment functions best, and you do it best when in fact you start as a really careful reader of poetry with an ear to why does this overall sound the way that it does. And ideally what you find is that an overall voice is the product of a lot of very small individual decisions that a writer makes. And in fact, the definition of style is just the cumulative decisions that a writer has made. And that includes word choice, line length, subject matter, all of those things. All of that put together is style, which is otherwise kind of a difficult term to define in any meaningful way. So this completing a poem exercise is one that you should really add to your toolbox here of things that you return to. Again, not because on the end of it you have a poem that now you can use to submit or that is useful in a portfolio, but because it is just amazingly helpful in terms of improving as a writer. It's like, again, the analogy, the sports analogy is that with writing, as with any other kind of skill, you end up practicing a lot of small kind of, you do drills, you do exercises, you do small components of the larger whole before, you work on that part of it before you really put all those skills together in a game time situation. The same thing goes with poetry. It really is worth spending time doing exercises like this, and even that term sounds like it's something lesser or just sort of like work. But this kind of exercise, I'm trying to think of a different word, but I can't. So this kind of exercise really is just so important for attuning your ear and ends up really helping you to develop a voice, not because you really develop your own coming out of this, but because you become so good at determining or becoming aware of what goes into making someone else's poetic voice. And again, like I said, people shy away from maybe, I don't want to sound like that, or I don't want to read too much because then I'll just sound imitative or unoriginal. It just doesn't work that way. To be a good writer, there's only maybe one rule, is that you have to be a good reader. Even if you read something and don't like it, that is still productive because you can say what you didn't like. So being a good reader means that you can say you didn't like the voice, you didn't like these choices, which is really another way of saying I didn't like the style of this, but style is such an overall thing. If you can begin to break that down and say, I didn't like the choice of first person versus third, I didn't like the choice of rhyming, not rhyming, I didn't like the choice of line length, I didn't like the word choices, I didn't like the way that imagery moved from this one to that one to this one because there was no connection, or one sort of contradicted the other. So even reading negative examples become useful. They have a productive use for you. In as much as they attune your ear, you become a better reader, and that is fundamentally the place to start to become a better writer. Not even the place to start, the place to return to continually become a better writer. So even if you are what you'd call or feel as a fairly experienced writer, you've written for publication, you've written intentionally for a number of years now, not sort of therapeutic writing, but writing specifically for an audience. Even if you've done a lot of that and feel fairly experienced, returning to these kinds of exercises and attuning your ear once again, almost like retuning a piano or a guitar, we do lose that sort of ability to be very careful readers. And so if you run into writer's block, for example, something as practical as that, reading is a good antidote, but this sort of reading with a view to, okay, I'm going to force myself to add 5 lines to this poem. Pick a poem that you don't like, right, or whose style is totally not what you would ever write in, and add 5 lines to that one, or 10, or whatever. You find that really jump starts sort of your own writing again, and the development of your own poetic voice. And I think we are all, novice and experienced writer alike, we're all concerned with developing and continuing to refine our poetic voice. And so again, it seems counterintuitive that to do so, we would defer to these other poetic voices or voices that aren't ours. But in fact, doing so is really a fundamental building block for continuing to develop and refine our own poetic voices. So hopefully you found that exercise interesting, but also now maybe see how it's something worth returning to and its broader value in terms of developing our own ability as writers and as poets. Okay, so especially as we get into our next workshop, be in touch with me if you have any questions, or again, if you don't see your name in one of the groups. And we are halfway through the term, so stay focused, just a couple more weeks to go, and be in touch if you have any questions.